I'm delighted that Abby Cohn, who is a professor of linguistics and Southeast Asian studies at Cornell, is able to come and give the keynote address here at COTSEAL. Let me just give you a little background. I know you met her yesterday, and many of you probably know her interests, but I'd just like to say that her background is she got a BA in Cornell in English, and then she got a MA at Illinois University in linguistics, and then went on for her PhD at UCLA. Her interest is in Austronesian languages of Indonesia, and her focus is on phonology, phonetics, and morphology. Recently, she has taken up an interest in sociolinguistics of Indonesia, and was a Fulbright scholar doing research out of University of Atmajaya, Jakarta, and her research is on the shift in speech of young Indonesians who are now not speaking their local ethnic language, but are speaking Indonesian as their first language. And she specifically was looking at the influence of Sundanese language on spoken Indonesian. So she has a wide variety of interests. Today she's going to be talking about the Southeast Asian language teaching in the U.S., teaching Southeast Asian languages in institutions here in the U.S., and the impact of national priorities and institutional policies. And she'd like a lot of discussion afterwards, so let me introduce and turn it over to Abby.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you, and especially thanks to Frank and COTSEAL for this invitation. So you might wonder sort of what am I doing here, because I'm not a Southeast Asian language teacher. And I guess I would characterize myself as a Southeast Asia and less commonly taught language ally. And I think as we think about institutional issues, one thing I think is very useful to think about is who are your allies, right? We all have sort of different institutional settings, and within each of those, how do things work? And one of the points of discussion that I'd like to come back to is really what is the institutional setting that different people are working within, and where are those points of challenge and where are the points of potential collaboration. Okay, so let's see. I also took this opportunity just to kind of step back, just kind of think about what's the lay of the land. And one thing that we all know, but sometimes it's useful to reflect on, is what's the motivation for studying Southeast Asian languages? Of course, there are students who just are interested in proficiency in the language for academic, professional, and personal reasons. Of course, there's our intrinsic academic interests. It's an important world region. There's an intrinsic interest in the political and economic importance in Southeast Asia. Some of the countries are of very significant strategic importance. Indonesia is identified as being of strategic importance. The question of heritage languages is a very major question. We heard about that both yesterday and today, and that is something not unique to Southeast Asia, but of great importance for Southeast Asian languages. Some people are drawn to Southeast Asian languages just for cross-cultural awareness. It's that much more interesting to learn about a culture of Southeast Asia than maybe to learn about France, right? And then there's increased dialogue and sort of a discussion out there about sort of becoming global citizens and learning about developing nations and so on. So there are many, many reasons that people might be drawn to studying Southeast Asian languages. Now, I want to think first about the issue of Southeast Asian languages as part of a university curriculum. And I want to talk about, then I'm going to talk about Southeast Asian languages as sort of a national resource, what we're doing as collectively creating a national resource. I want to touch on the current climate in higher education and institutional landscapes. And I'm sorry to say there's nothing positive that I have to say in that particular arena. But coming out of that, then I want to focus on what can we do, how can we respond to the mandate that we have to be collectively to be teaching the Southeast Asian languages. How do we achieve that in this current climate? And I want to sort of focus on 3 take-home messages. The critical need for collaboration at every level, the importance and critical need for professional development for Southeast Asian language teachers, and the rather two-edged but important role of innovation in teaching. And I'm really glad that we had the time we did yesterday to talk about distance learning, because that is one of the areas that many of us have been sort of pondering and thinking about. And then I want to highlight, and I'm not just saying this because this is the COTSEAL meeting, but I want to highlight the important role that COTSEAL plays and can continue to play as the vehicle to support these goals. Okay. Okay, so background, Southeast Asian languages as less commonly taught languages. And a few of you heard me talk about this. We had participated in a COTSEAL panel at the AAS in Philadelphia, and so some of what I'm about to say was presented there. Okay, so what are less commonly taught languages? We're all teaching less commonly taught languages, but the way I characterize the Southeast Asian languages are the least commonly taught of the less commonly taught languages. What does that mean? So that's what I want to spend a few minutes shaping and highlighting. So the strict definition, or the sort of what used to be the definition of less commonly taught languages, was everything besides Spanish, French, and German. In the old days, that was sort of how it was defined. Some of you might be familiar with the Carla database at University of Minnesota, where you can look at where languages are being taught. So unfortunately, it's not being maintained anymore, and so it is sort of useful, but not as useful as we wish. The MLA also does reports on the enrollment of languages other than English, and they just released their most recent report, dated 2015, with data going through 2013. I'm going to talk about the earlier instantiation of the report, the 2009 data. And the reason is that the most recent report does not make it very easy to extract the things that were extractable in the 2009 report. So the data I'm going to talk about a little bit are not the most recent. For anyone who hasn't looked at those reports, they're very, very interesting. It's very helpful to see where the language or languages you teach fit in on this sort of national plane. So I think the MLA enrollments in languages other than English gives a better definition. They basically say that for the purposes of this report, we characterize as less commonly taught all languages other than the top 15. And that, I think, is a fairer sort of characterization. And in the 2009 report, the top 15 were Spanish, which accounts for over 50% and still does. Half the language is half of the individuals studying a language at the higher education level are studying Spanish. So that's 50% right there. Then French, German, ASL, which actually in the most recent report has leapfrogged over German. Italian, Japanese, Chinese, Arabic, Latin, Russian, Greek, Hebrew, Portuguese, Korean, Hebrew. Everything else is less commonly taught. Those languages together, the top 15, make up 97.5% of the students studying a foreign language. And so that's pretty amazing. So all the rest, and they discuss over 300 in the report, make up 2.5%. The less commonly taught languages made a small gain between 2009 and 2013 because we went up to 2.6% from 2.5%. Okay, Bill Rivers of the Joint National Committee for Languages at the Eiffel Technical Meeting a year ago fall characterized less commonly taught languages as being in 3 tiers. Talked about the common languages. Then tier 1 were less commonly taught languages with 10,000 to 80,000 students studying them. Tier 2 was 1,000 to 10,000, and tier 3 was less than 1,000. I think to understand our shared problem in terms of teaching and promoting the languages of Southeast Asia, we need to add what I characterize as Tier 3 plus, which would be languages with less than 500, and then Tier 3 plus plus, which would be languages with less than 100. Taking the numbers from the most recent MLA report, these are the top 15 leading Asian or Pacific less commonly taught languages. And so this leaves out, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, because those made it in the top 15. And so these are the numbers. And Hindi slightly edges out Vietnamese. So Vietnamese and Tagalog are, they're doing okay, and we kind of drop off after that. I didn't include Mandarin because it's a terminological change. It's sort of this terminological ambiguity. And I did not include Sanskrit or classical Chinese. And I didn't include Sanskrit because I don't think of it as a spoken language, but I saw down the hall that it said, come study spoken Sanskrit. Yeah. So I don't know what that's about, but we don't have to resolve that today. Okay, so we could say that Vietnamese and then Filipino or Tagalog, and I'm going to actually refer to it as Tagalog, and I'm not going to spend time resolving the issue about Filipino and Tagalog. We'll leave that aside. Okay? All right, thank you. So Vietnamese and Tagalog are Tier 2. Hmong made it into Tier 3. And then we might say that Thai and Indonesian are Tier 3 plus. And then there's Burmese and Khmer down there in Tier 3 plus plus. And they didn't even include Lao on the list. Okay, but it is taught at CIC. So, in what follows, I'm going to focus, not in any way to slight anybody, but I'm not going to include in my discussion right here Hmong, and I'm not going to include Lao, just because I'm going to focus on the 6 sort of more major ones that we teach, and this just highlights, right? You can be an important language that doesn't even make it into the group of the Tier 3 plus, So these are real issues. So what I did was I looked at the relationship between the population of the major countries of Southeast Asia, and this was based on Wikipedia. And I looked at the number of students studying those national languages and the relative rank of those languages. And I also looked at the number of institutions based on the Carla database. And so these numbers are squishy. These are not particularly precise numbers, but they're very useful to give us a relative comparison. So as I said, I'm going to focus on the major national languages. We've got labeling problems and so on, but Indonesia, as we all know, is the 4th most populous country in the world, and we might compare it with Japan, which has roughly half the population. And we see that Japanese is the 6th most widely taught language, with 943 institutions teaching it, compared to 28 for Indonesian. It comes in rank at 54th, and it compares in population to Brazil, which comes in at 13th. Then we've got the Philippines, Vietnamese, and Thailand, which are all roughly the size of like Germany or France. And so, Germany used to be number 3, got demoted to number 4, but okay. France, and yet we see that the number of institutions are in the dozens, and rank in terms of how many students are taking it are, clearly much lower. So we might compare those 3 actually to South Korea, right, or to Korean. And if we take the population of South Korea and North Korea together, then we're in this ballpark, right? We're in the high tens of millions. And so unlike the other languages, Korean is the 4th most widely studied language, and it's taught at 146 institutions. Then we get down to Myanmar, which has roughly the population of Italy, which is was fourth most, now fifth most widely taught, and even the Netherlands is up there at 37 compared to Cambodia, which is taught at 8 institutions and is 80th in the ranked list. So what does this mean? So we've got all of Southeast Asia with, again, a very rough population estimate of 618 million, compared, for example, to Western Europe with a mere 397 million people. And yet we see this very sharp contrast in how often these languages are studied. So the conclusion is that training in the languages and cultures of Southeast Asia is terribly underrepresented relative to not just the population, but the strategic importance in so many different ways. So what that means is that the combined effort of the teaching that all of you guys are doing during the year and the work that's done at CIC, as well as the in-country programs, are just of critical importance for capacity building, okay? What happens among this group, a very, very small group of people is carrying the weight of this very, very important job. And we should never lose sight of that. And we need to remind our administrators about that. We need to, at every level, we need to keep reminding people of that. So there's some particular challenges that you all face by virtue of being very small. So first of all, and we'll get back to this when we talk about the current budgetary climate, small languages are very vulnerable to cuts. But the stupid part is you cut a small language and you cut an incredibly large percent of an important resource. You cut a section of Spanish, who the hell cares, right? I mean, well, okay, I didn't say that, okay. But come on, right? Okay, so then the effort that's involved in providing effective language instruction from beginning to advanced levels, including teaching materials, language, teacher training, assessment, is no less involved for these languages, and yet a very, very small number of people has to share the burden of that, right? So everyone has that much more work to do. And so in effect, the same amount of work, because it really is the same amount of work, is being done by this minuscule group of people. The number of people who are preparing materials for Burmese compared to Spanish, right? And, as we well know and have heard over the past couple days, frankly, it's a little harder to teach Burmese than it is to teach Spanish, right? There are additional complexities in terms of non-Roman scripts, in terms of the phonology, in terms of the cultural context, right? It's a complicated job. Then it gets made, I think, both more complicated and more interesting by the fact that Southeast Asian languages are particularly affected by very heterogeneous, diverse audiences, often with very specific goals. So there can be grads, there can be undergrads, there might be heritage students, there might be people doing specialized research. And this really differs from the typical pattern. So this is a challenge, but I know that many of you embrace this also as an enrichment of what you do. But it's hard. You might have 6 students and each one is there for some totally different reason, right? And so I think that oftentimes the pedagogical aims can vary a lot, both within a language and across language programs. These are just, enrollment percentages just from Cornell, just to take a snapshot. And what I've done here is that the first column is the overall distribution of the students taking languages. So 90% are undergrads, 10% are grad students. Okay, that's the general profile. However, and 63, or roughly 2/3, are in the College of Arts and Sciences. Now, arts and sciences includes everything from the humanities, social sciences, and sciences at Cornell, but nevertheless, those are the students doing a quote-unquote liberal arts education, and they have a language requirement, and there's a certain intellectual context that frames what they're doing, whereas the students outside of arts and sciences might be doing very different things. So that's the rough profile. Well, what we can see is that almost all of the Southeast Asian languages taught at Cornell profile differs. We see that with the exception of Tagalog, the percent of grad students is way higher, right? So it's already being done in part maybe for research training and other purposes. And we can also see that the percent of students outside arts and science is much, much higher. So this just exemplifies this diversity of population. Okay, so I want to turn and talk a little bit about Southeast Asian languages as a national resource. And I think we need to take this seriously. I think that no matter what we do within our home institution or compared to other institutions, we somehow see ourselves in competition, right? And yet I think that the only way we are going to survive is if we see ourselves as collaborating at every level. When we were putting in the last cycle for the NRCs, we really took new steps to do that. And Ellen put in for a language resource center, which unfortunately wasn't funded, but that was also a great opportunity to start this conversation. And COTSEAL is all the more important because of that. This is really the organization that can foster the mechanism for that kind of collaboration. So traditionally, and I apologize here because some of you I know are very familiar with this information and some of you might not be, so I wanted just to frame this. The Department of Education National Resource Centers played a critical role in the development of the teaching of Southeast Asian languages in the US. The first go-round of the development of teaching materials and so on. This started post-World War II, but was really carried out in the 60s and 70s. So the NRCs are still very important, but in fact, a couple things has happened. One is the funding is actually quite limited, and there's just a diversity of language programs. And again, COTSEAL is very important. It can't just be the collaboration of the NRCs that are going to carry this forward. That's sort of how it used to be. We sort of assumed the only places that cared about these languages were the NRCs or ones that might be NRCs. But that's just not true anymore. There's this diversity of where these languages are, where there's interest and where these are taught. And I think California is particularly interested in this regard. One of the things characterized in the MLA report is the difference between what's going on at 4-year institutions and the 2-year institutions. And so when we see the role of heritage languages, we see that very dramatically at the 2-year institution level. So there's just a lot of interesting stuff happening. Okay, so the Department of Education, roughly a $68 billion budget, and within the Department of Education, there's this Office of Post-Secondary Education, and within the Department of the Office of Post-Secondary Education, we have the International and Foreign Language Education Division. And in the last go-round, to fund the Title VI programs, which include 5 programs, but most importantly for us are the National Resource Centers and also the Foreign Language Area Fellowship, which make up over 2/3 of the funding. They got $63 million. Now you might think $63 million sounds pretty good, but that's 0.1% of this whole budget, right? There are currently, I believe, 7 designated centers that are. So those institutions that teach Southeast Asian languages, especially those of us with the NRC designations, truly are national resource centers. The weight falls on us to do this work. Collectively, we cover language instruction for a critically important and relatively understudied part of the world. I understand the NRCs to be 3-legged stools. They consist of the faculty, the library, resources, and language instruction. And we need to be sure that at our institutions, people understand that and appreciate the critical importance of language instruction. And let me just cite a recent example that I found actually very heartening. We, for years, taught Burmese at Cornell, even though we had minuscule enrollments, and we were just lucky. We were able to do it because San also taught French, and so we were able to pay for part of her position, and we maintained Burmese for years. Okay. Well, what's happened? What's happened is, and then San left, and we've kind of, things been shaky, but we persevered. What happened, though, is in the last couple of years, our enrollments in Burmese have gone back up, and we've started to attract prospective graduate students in all of our graduate programs who want to work on Burma. And so all of a sudden, the fact that we were continuing to teach Burmese became the seed that allowed us to quite quickly really boost this program. And on the basis of that, we were able to piece together the funding, and we've just hired a full-time lecturer position in Burmese, and we're really excited about that. So even if things seem like they're hanging on by a thread, don't let them go, because those threads are very important. Okay, I'm also going to present some data which we put together last spring collectively when we were doing the COTSEAL panel at AAS, and we got data from the then-funded NRCs, and Mary Jo helped us a lot on this and also provided CIC data. So what does this look like? So these are just the number of institutions offering the NRC institutions. And one of the things that, so we've got Filipino, Indonesian, Khmer, Thai, Vietnamese. What's interesting is that there really is this difference in the languages that all the centers teach and additional places. And then we have Burmese, Malay, and I guess I'm not going to worry about Indonesian versus Malay, but we should leave that question aside. Hmong and Ilocano. And so we sort of see this tier 3+ versus the 3++ issue. This is the total number of students for like a 2-year period. I'm more than happy to make these slides available, so if anyone is interested in the details, that's fine. So what we can see in terms of capacity building is that there's this split, right, between the languages really offered at most of the centers and then the more specialized ones. And I would actually say, just as an aside, building up on what we were talking about yesterday, it would be the second group of languages that we should consider doing distance learning, right? The languages that really are only offered 2 places are the ones we should be privileging. We don't want to risk diminishing the resources going into the more commonly taught languages. That should be the bread and butter of having a center, right? Or saying that you are engaged in Southeast Asian languages. The numbers are relatively stable, and you see both, there's grads and undergrads, and I've already talked a little bit about the increased importance or role of heritage speaking. Now, my favorite graph is what has happened in what's going on in CIC enrollment since '84 through 2013.
How my brain works.
And well, we can see a number of things. So Carol and I were just talking about how CIC started out as ISI. It started out as an Indonesian Summer Studies Institute. And part of those high numbers in Indonesian are due to that. But it's also, we can see this kind of, we just see this general trend with other languages becoming increasingly important. But there's also an unfortunate overall trend, which is the total numbers have dropped. And that has partially to do with funding structure. And I personally, I'm preaching to the choir here, but maintaining and supporting CIC is one of the, something that we collectively have a responsibility for. I think the fact that as funding gets tight and people sort of start scrimping here and so on, that has had a very problematic and negative impact. So go back to your institutions and remind them that CIC is one of the most important things we do as an intellectual community. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Okay, so what about the current climate in higher education? and this is the grim part of the talk, so whatever. Okay, so first of all, we are all aware of this kind of shift in orientation. There's this general rhetoric going on. We need to make what we do at the university relevant, and we need skill-based learning. And what are we doing these frivolous things for, especially in the state of Wisconsin?
Yes.
Yes. Even within the Department of Ed, we are facing a shift in orientation. Wow.
They're great.
Yes. So, under the leadership of Arnie Duncan, there has been this very strong emphasis on early education, and that's important. It is important, you know, strengthening, and we know how important that foundation is. But unfortunately, we know that what's happened is there's been a lack of awareness of sort of what's the full palette of things we need to support. So many of you know that, what is it? I guess 4 or 5 years ago now, when there were cuts to the Department of Education, the international programs were disproportionately cut. Every federal agency sustained a roughly 5% cut, and the Department of Ed, in their wisdom, thought that the international programs, which we already saw make up 0.1%, should sustain a 40% cut, right? I mean, this is nutty, and we were all thrilled last year when Title VI was reauthorized at that 40% cut level. Like we're still 40% down from where we were several years ago, and we were all like grateful that we weren't cut further, right? So this is not a good climate, federally either. At the same time, there's all this talk about increased internationalization of the curriculum. And this is interesting because in some ways that might be helpful or favorable for us, but in some ways kind of either hasn't helped or it's even made things worse, right? It just sort of means more money is going to the more common or popular activities. I think we need to use these points as leverage, right? We need to remind our administrations that this is not only international education that we've all been doing all along, but it's of the most important kind, right? So next, we've all faced, there's increased accountability. There's increased, more assessment at every level. There are these performance measures. And again, this disproportionately impacts the work of each and every instructor, right? Because things like designing OPI criteria falls to this incredibly small group of people, and yet it's still required and mandated, right? So those are challenges. Now, really since 2008, but probably before that, we all faced financial pressures, right? There were state budget cuts, private schools saw precipitous drops in their endowments, and I'm just learning about this, and I'm not happy that I am learning about it, but many universities are moving toward these RCM, these responsibility-centered management models. And what are they moving from? Well, at Cornell, we supposedly were moving from a centralized budget model, which meant that most of the money went through the provost. But frankly, what we had was no budget model, but okay. But the problem with these responsibility-centered management models is that they privilege certain things and they don't even count other things. And so this promotes a certain kind of bean counting, and it promotes what some of my colleagues call butts in seats, right? So this is not good for us, but it's not good for any of us, right? That shouldn't be what education is about. You know, we claim Cornell's slogan since its founding 150 years ago was, "I will found an institution where anybody can find instruction in any subject." So the now cynical statement, because we've just explicitly added, enrollment floors, and I realize how privileged we are because the enrollment floor we're talking about is 6 people per class, which I know many of you have been fighting with much, much higher floors than that for a long time. So the new slogan is, I will found an institution where any 6 people can find instruction in any subject. The problem is that the Southeast Asian languages are particularly vulnerable. They're perceived to be expensive, which is not true, frankly. And they're thought to be less relevant, which is not true. And what happens is that this paramount importance that's being given to enrollments now creates a very striking mismatch to our collective responsibility to make a scarce resource available. Right? You can't measure the value of a national resource, which is what we are collectively doing, in terms of undergraduate enrollment, right? This just can't be how we compute. But when these new models are instituted, and we ourselves are not making the case, and we ourselves don't have administrative allies to make the case for us, then we're really in trouble. So we had a nice example yesterday, we're hearing about at UCLA, where those arguments have been made and have been effective, but we all need to figure out how to do that. We need to talk to each other to get strategies. Like, how do I make the case to my dean that just counting the number of people taking a particular language it's nonsensical. It's not what education is about. So there are these tensions, right? That we need to increase enrollment, so we're all working to do that. But at the same time, we need to be making the case that these metrics really aren't the right metrics. But we sort of have to do both. We have to play both sides, right? I've been thinking a lot, and Yolanda and I were just talking about this on the way here. How do we pitch all of the less commonly taught languages? I saw a very nice brochure here, evidently put out by the Language Center at Wisconsin, which promotes all the languages. So when given the chance, when I'm advising freshmen, I try to make the case, why study Spanish when you can study Indonesian? So those are the kinds of things we need to do. And if I make that case and somebody decides to study Pashto instead, that's still a success, right? I don't need to feel that because somebody is taking some other less commonly taught language that I've lost somehow. Because if we all share that message, we're all going to benefit from it. Okay. What about demographics and trends? Well, these are kind of hurting us too. We have an age demographics. Instruction, as I said before, Southeast Asian languages developed post-World War II and was very strong in the 60s and early 70s. And that first generation, and even some of the second generation, are retiring, right? And as we talked about yesterday, one of the things that's happening is that in the past, many of the language instructors had professorial appointments, and now these people typically have lecturer positions. But even worse than that is that a lot of people don't have full-time, regular, permanent positions. There are increased use of adjunct instructors, and so this creates a lot of instability for our languages and is a really problematic issue. So all of this adds up to a very challenging landscape. So what can we do about it? Well, I would suggest that what we need to do is collaboration, professional development, and innovation. So there's a critical importance for collaboration where we need to see each of others as, in every level, as partners and not competitors, right? In terms of the contributions we make to year-long instruction, summer instruction, in-country programs. And we, all of us together then, contribute collectively to the multifaceted need for language education in this heretofore relatively understudied world region. So we need to use these collaborations to make each of our jobs easier, right? We need to share our materials so that we can all enrich what we're doing. And we need to think about how collectively to do innovations. And we've heard about some exciting things over the past couple of days, but now we need to leverage those together, and we need to develop those. So I would argue we need to collaborate at every level. We need to collaborate locally. Okay, yep. We need we need allies. We need to work together with the other Southeast Asian language instructors. We need to work together with the other less commonly taught languages. We need to work, if we have a language resource center, we need to work with them. If we have a language and culture department, work with them. For those of us with NRCs, we really need to work within our NRCs, work with Southeast Asia faculty who have interests. Go do a search if you have, most universities now have these search engines where you can search what the faculty interests are. Do a search for each of your countries, and you'll be surprised to find out the people on your campus who are interested in Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, who you might not even have met, and meet them for lunch. And then international study centers, and then across our institutions, both the NRCs and COTSEAL, I think, are of critical importance. Embrace professional development. Be a leader on your campus. So make use of whatever professional development opportunities there are. Whether, if you're not on the list and finding out about what's going on at your language resource center, find out. Through COTSEAL, work through that. And then there are opportunities that come up. Hawaii has programs, ACTFL has programs, and so on. Be innovative. We already talked quite a bit about that yesterday. And I just want to end then by talking about how important COTSEAL is and how lucky we are that we have this history. I was talking to a colleague who is the director of South Asia at Cornell, and she just was like, we have nothing like that for South Asian languages. She said that there isn't this comparable organization and network. So while the Southeast Asian language instructors are a very small community, this serves as an important vehicle for collaboration, both for, and offers resources for professional development, for example, the upcoming workshops, and that together means that together we can work on collective innovations. So, thank you. So I'm happy to take questions, but I also had some particular questions for you guys. So let me just put up the 2 slides with those questions, and maybe I can take questions and we can answer questions. So I want to think, I'd love to know more about who your audience is when you're teaching, what your enrollment challenges are, what are both the challenges and opportunities. And then I'm also very interested just in sort of what everyone's local institutional landscape is. And I think we actually stand to learn a lot from each other. We kind of assume that the way things work at our own institution must be the way it is elsewhere, and it's just not true. So sometimes you talk to somebody else and you might either come to appreciate something about your own situation, or you might get a really clever idea. You might come to think about, oh wow, I could tackle that problem in the following way. So I really would think about who your natural partners for collaboration are. So, thank you.
Hi. I would like to introduce myself to you. I'm speaking Lao. That person, including Dr. Cohn.
Yes.
So, it's not sad that, you know, Laos have no tears. Where are they?
Yes, yes, yeah. So,
Yes.
yeah. And so, I mean, it's interesting because it's a national language.
Yes.
And it's not even on the map.
Right,
Yes.
so sad.
Yes.
Anyway,
So what are we going to do about it?
yes, what are we gonna do? You got a lot of information. You know, as you point out greatly good point for us to start. You know, CIC is the best. So at Cornell, do they have Lao language offer?
No. But-
Anywhere else?
No, so Greg Green, who is our, the curator of the Southeast Asian library collection, is fluent in Lao, has worked on it, and he's very interested in, we think that for Lao we should actually develop a different model, and that we probably should consider asynchronous distance learning to create during the year opportunities for Lao, because it's not being taught regularly anywhere during the year. And so it requires special arrangements, but I think we should be talking. Yeah.
It would be great. You know, so CIC did wonderful job so far.
Yes.
Thankfulness to Dr. Cohn who started and make it happen.
Yeah.
For us as a young girl to follow, and for the young girl to follow again.
Absolutely.
So appreciate that.
Yes.
And then also right now, since you've got all the information, I don't know, we all should come together along with the COTSEAL to make it happen. That would be great.
Great. Yes. Questions or comments?
Yeah, I'd like to ask question in general, the term about the data, compared to during the Vietnam War as until now. What's the percentage of enrollment that people interested in learning about Southeast Asia? So
That's a great question. I haven't looked at it that way, but the MLA report does have the longitudinal data for each language. The problem with this current version is it's alphabetical and not by rank in the 2009 report. So it wouldn't be that difficult to go through and pull out our 8 to 9 languages that we're interested in and make a graph of precisely that. I think if you think about, let's look at our, the closest that I have here that even allows us to think about that is the CIC data, right? But what we could do is push back and really see what was happening before that. What I think is interesting, if I were to do an analysis of this, I would want to look at so in World War II provided the sort of seeds for greater involvement in less commonly taught languages in the US. But the Vietnam War certainly was pivotal in terms of the connection or orientation toward Southeast Asia. We can look at population developments. We can look at all these different events and then see how that relates to what we're teaching. And what I find so interesting, and coming from an area where we don't have a lot of heritage speakers, I'm a newcomer to this, but I think when we look at what's happening with our heritage speaker populations, those are the seeds of the Vietnam War, right? And those communities and where they settled and what's happening with those linguistic communities are all part of that history. Yes?
This is just a little addendum, but what I'm going to say, I'll take it and say that it can be projected to a number of languages like Burmese, Khmer, etc. In the 1970s and probably in the 1960s, both Cornell and the University of Hawaii taught Lao and Burmese, and I can't remember about Khmer. So if we were pushed back historically and we looked at the institutions that taught some of the even more or less commonly taught languages, we could also get an idea of places where you might be able to reopen something. Currently, we don't have anywhere teaching Lao. We have a few community colleges that might offer a heritage course now and again, but a consistent program. The Hmong community, to illustrate the heritage thing, wherever the Hmong community is strong and has pushed for it, something is happening either at the community college or university level, and that's certainly what happened here in Wisconsin and also at UW-Milwaukee at some point. So the combination of what Chua Lee was talking about of the working with the community, not just to support what CIC does or what your program in your institution does, but also to look at the support for the community so you don't get such terrible cuts at state levels, and which is another threat to our programs.
I think one of the important things is we can collaborate nationally, but we also have to work strategically locally to see what we can pitch, what makes sense, how do we build, how do we build those things? So. Yeah.
I greatly appreciate your presentation, and later I will also share some of my story that probably resonate to what Dr. Abby just said right now. When you said that we should also, not just to think of collaboration only for the NIC center. This means that, it's tying to the question that maybe Dr. Carroll just said to that how we can actually try to tap into the local university. This thing, I think that will be helpful, because to me, I feel like in the past, maybe because Ohio has not received the funding, has not been vaccinated designated as an NIC. So we feel that we are not part of you. So, these groups, so sometimes we wanted to share and also ask for some help as well. So, but do you have something that more concrete that we can work together? Because I think we can talk about, yes, the term collaboration, but it's hard to think, like how, because when you teach as well, and then you try to convince the administrator, this is what we can do, this is what we can do together with others institutions. So
I think a couple things. I think that we can kind of band together as Southeast Asian languages, but I think we need to strengthen, maybe informally, but collaboratively within each language. That we really, the Indonesian group is probably the strongest, and it's partially because we still have COTSEAL, and that brings us together, but there's a little, I think there's more fabric there, but we need to build that fabric for Thai, for Tagalog, for Vietnamese. And I actually think that the proposed workshops are a great way to do that, because the idea is to establish these little collaborative working groups for each language and build those. I would love to see us have sort of a council for each of those languages, and we're talking about at least establishing a website presence for each language so that people can start to share. So what I would really encourage people to do is, however you can connect across the Thai instructors, across the Vietnamese instructors, build that, share what you're doing. I was mentioned to Yolanda earlier, this Burmese pronunciation project. I would suggest that with a project like that, we share that across anyone teaching that language, right? We're specialized enough. That shouldn't be because you're enrolled at Cornell, it should be because you're studying Burmese, right? And when we think about materials development, we should think about it being for that next level. And we just need to constantly remind everyone that this has to be collaborative. Yeah, Ellen.
Yeah, I was just thinking of this situation where Ohio doesn't get funded. And the wonderful aim of trying to imagine having enough organization or funds to get all of these councils. I wonder if COTSEAL might consider trying to sponsor, in cyberspace, some meeting where anybody teaching Thai could, get together and talk about a problem, or share resources, or
You could have webinars.
because it is hard if you're, you don't have any money, and clearly you'd like to collaborate, but how do I collaborate? And I'm thinking, what do we have? Because the NRCs are one thing, but COTSEAL covers the whole nation, and
And also that you can, with some of the groups such as COTI, we all know about COTI, but there's also VASI for Vietnamese, where there are summer institutes. Guava, I'm sorry, but they sponsor VASI, but it's called Guava. But there are some other groups, is what I was trying to say.
Right, but the problem is the summer programs aren't happening and the groups are sort of hanging on.
Yeah,
by a
when they're
thread.
not getting funding, right, but
Yeah.
they even more so need to pull
Absolutely,
together as a group.
Yeah.
And the same for the Thai group, which has, waned and so forth. And then I know Kuwait has a foreign language thing for Thai, because I get that. But for the COTSEAL website, either to have a connection, and maybe you do, Frank, because I don't go on that often, but a connection to those groups, or the heads of COTI and Guava and whoever.
Well, there's a link to every organization we know about,
Yeah, any
to
organization.
their website, that's
And
it.
it may be up there, I don't know, but we probably need to tell new members about it, that it exists, or that there's something in their field that exists that they may not know about if they come from an institution not connected, like Cornell or.
Yeah. Let me, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for a very nice presentation. Now I come from the region itself. I just wonder, since you talk about collaboration, by my surprise, in the region, the idea of ASEAN community apparently is huge. It motivates governments to throw money for area studies. So I just wonder how Southeast Asian language teachers in the US respond or kind of tap into that kind of opportunities in the region itself.
Yeah, so I can only talk to that for Indonesia. And I will say, when I was in Indonesia 3 years ago, I really tried to find out what was going on and find out where there were BIPA programs and so on. And I didn't make much headway, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying. But there weren't obvious points of contact. There were not obvious resources where I could say, hey, can we partner on this thing? So I think it makes sense to ask and to keep looking at that. But I didn't find easy answers. Now, maybe I was looking in the wrong places, I don't know.
Well, just recently, like speaking of Indonesian context, government just threw money, giving at least targeting 6 or 8 public universities to open or to start Southeast Asian studies. There's a big question about IFIs, whether it's only like Indonesia-US kind of relation, or do you want to expand to more Southeast Asia?
It can't.
There's
I mean, it's
interest
purely
interest.
bilateral, and we already have a bilateral there are other
I see.
bilateral centers, but I think that's a very interesting question. But I think we have to stop now.
Yeah, we do,
But,
yeah.
thank you so much, and happy to talk to you.